The air was thick with sweat and the metallic tang of blood. Cheers and jeers blended into a chaotic roar, surrounding the underground fight club like a suffocating fog. Kane leaned against the back wall, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hood. His calloused hands fidgeted with a frayed photograph in his pocket, a glimpse of a family long gone, a reminder of the life he had once chosen to destroy. He didn't want to be here. Yet, the world of blood and fists had a way of pulling him back, no matter how far he tried to run. In the center of the dimly lit ring, the crowd surged as a fighter collapsed to the floor, his face bloodied and unrecognizable. A towering figure stood over him, arms raised in victory. This was Dante. The name rippled through the crowd like a threat, a declaration of dominance. Kane didn't need to see more to know the truth. Dante wasn't just a fighter. He was a monster, a man who fought not for survival but for the sheer pleasure of breaking others. Kane's attention shifted as the fallen fighter's corner erupted into panic. Among them was Joey, Kane's old friend, now struggling to lift the defeated man onto his shoulders. Blood seeped through Joey's shirt, staining his hands. Their eyes met briefly. Joey gave Kane a small, desperate shake of the head, a silent plea for help. Kane turned away, clenching his fists, trying to suppress the guilt that clawed at him. But then Dante's voice rang out, cutting through the noise. "Anyone else want to end up like this?" His tone was calm, cold, and dripping with arrogance. He leaned against the ropes, scanning the crowd. "What about you?" His eyes locked on Kane, a slow, cruel smirk curling his lips. "You look like you could use a fight." The crowd turned, murmurs rippling like an electric current. Kane remained still, his heart pounding against his ribs. He didn't move, didn't speak. He had spent years burying this part of himself, swearing never to let it surface again. But Dante's laughter followed, sharp and grating. "Coward," he spat, turning away. Joey caught up to Kane outside, his face pale. "You can't let him keep doing this," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "People are getting hurt. Real bad." "It's not my fight," Kane muttered, pulling the hood tighter over his head. Joey grabbed his arm, forcing him to stop. "It is your fight. It's always been your fight. You just don't want to admit it." Kane stared at him, torn between anger and shame. Joey let go, stepping back. "You are the best, Kane. Maybe not the greatest man, but the best fighter. If you walk away now, that's on you." As Joey disappeared into the shadows, Kane stood frozen. He pulled the photograph from his pocket, staring at the smiling faces that no longer waited for him. His thumb brushed over the edges as a memory flickered to life, a daughter's laughter, a wife's gentle embrace. He had fought for them once. Could he fight for something again? Kane tightened the wraps around his knuckles, the coarse fabric biting into his skin. The abandoned gym reeked of mildew and rust, its silence broken only by the rhythmic creak of an old punching bag swaying in front of him. His fists pounded against it, each strike sharper, harder. His movements were raw, deliberate, yet there was a stiffness to them, a rustiness born from years away from the ring. He paused, chest heaving, and stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror on the wall. The man staring back at him looked older, worn, and hollow. He didn't recognize himself anymore. In his mind, the memory of Dante's voice echoed, the mocking laughter, the arrogance. Every word had burrowed into Kane like a thorn, pushing him back into a world he had sworn to leave behind. He threw another punch, harder this time, as if the impact could silence the voice in his head. But it was never just about Dante. This was about proving he still had something left to fight for. By the time Kane paused to catch his breath, his knuckles were bleeding through the wraps. He grimaced, tearing them off and throwing them aside. He grabbed a chain and began pulling himself up, each pull-up more grueling than the last. His muscles screamed in protest, but he pushed through, chasing the strength he once had. In another corner of the city, Dante basked in his growing reputation. He was a force of nature in the ring, fast, brutal, and calculated. His training was a spectacle, his sparring partners often limping out with broken ribs or dislocated shoulders. He didn't just fight to win. He fought to dominate, to crush. Between rounds, Dante's manager leaned in, his voice low and confident. Kane's not what he used to be. If he steps in, you'll break him like the rest. He's just another relic of the past. Dante smirked, wiping sweat from his face. If he comes back, he's done. I'll end him. Kane wasn't blind to the growing shadow Dante cast. Between grueling training sessions, he found himself haunted by doubt. Every ache in his body, every pang of exhaustion reminded him of the years he had wasted. He knew he wasn't the fighter he once was, but what choice did he have now? Late one night, Kane stood outside a small suburban house. Through the window, he saw his daughter, now a teenager, sitting at the kitchen table, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone. She looked so much older than the last time he had seen her. For a moment, he hesitated, then knocked softly on the door. The sound echoed in the stillness of the street. When she opened it, her eyes widened in surprise before narrowing in suspicion. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice cold. Kane swallowed hard. "I just wanted to see you. To talk." "You're years too late for that," she replied sharply. Her words cut deeper than any punch ever had. She started to close the door, but Kane stepped forward. "Just give me a chance," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm trying to make things right." She hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. "You want to make things right? Don't come back until you've figured out who you are." She closed the door, leaving him standing alone in the cold night. Kane turned away, his resolve hardening. He had no room for doubt anymore. If he was going to fight, it wouldn't just be for revenge. It would be for redemption. The crowd was deafening, a sea of bodies packed into the underground arena. The air buzzed with energy, anticipation thick enough to choke on. In the center of the ring stood Dante, radiating confidence, his muscles taut and his eyes gleaming with the promise of violence. Across from him, Kane stepped into the light, his expression unreadable. Every pair of eyes in the room fixed on him, some with hope, others with doubt. His movements were steady, deliberate, but the weight of years away from the ring hung on his shoulders. This wasn't just a fight, it was everything he had left to prove. The bell rang, and Dante came at him like a storm, fists flying with precision and speed. Kane barely dodged the first blow, his body reacting on instinct honed from years past. The second punch grazed his ribs, sharp and unforgiving. Dante pressed forward, driving him back with a relentless flurry of strikes. Kane absorbed the hits, his guard tight, but the force behind each punch shook him to his core. The crowd roared with every impact, and for a moment, it seemed like Dante would end him in the opening round. But Kane wasn't here to fold. As Dante swung wide, Kane ducked low and countered with a solid jab to the ribs, followed by a sharp hook to the jaw. The strike stunned Dante for only a moment, but it was enough to remind everyone watching that Kane was still dangerous. Blood trickled from the corner of Dante's mouth, but he smirked, wiping it away with the back of his glove. "You've got some fight left," Dante growled, his voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. "Good. This'll be fun." The fight escalated, each round pushing Kane closer to his limits. Dante's blows were like sledgehammers, unrelenting and brutal, but Kane's experience kept him standing. He dodged, countered, and absorbed hits with a quiet determination. Every time he faltered, every time his legs threatened to give out, he thought of his daughter's words, her cold stare. He wasn't just fighting Dante, he was fighting his past, his failures, everything that had led him to this moment. By the third round, Kane's body was battered and bruised. Blood dripped from a gash above his eye, blurring his vision. Dante saw the weakness and pressed harder, landing a devastating blow to Kane's ribs that sent him crashing to the mat. The crowd erupted, half cheering, half screaming for him to get up. Kane lay there for a moment, gasping for air, his chest heaving. His hands gripped the canvas, knuckles white, as memories flooded his mind. His daughter's voice echoed in his ears, the weight of her disappointment heavy on his shoulders. Slowly, he pushed himself up, his legs trembling beneath him. The referee counted, but Kane wasn't done. He steadied himself, lifting his fists once more. The crowd's roar swelled as Dante's expression shifted from smug confidence to frustration. Kane met his gaze, and something shifted. This wasn't just about winning anymore, it was about surviving. Kane's movements became sharper, his strikes more calculated. He began to anticipate Dante's attacks, slipping punches and landing counters that rattled the towering fighter. Each hit carried the weight of years of regret, anger, and determination. Dante's confidence faltered as Kane landed a crushing uppercut, staggering him for the first time. The tide had turned. The crowd sensed it, their cheers growing louder, more frenzied. Kane didn't let up, his focus unshakable. He wasn't just fighting Dante, he was fighting for his redemption, for a chance to prove he was more than the mistakes of his past. Dante staggered, his once imposing frame now showing cracks. Blood trickled from his split lip, his chest heaving as he glared at Kane with a mixture of fury and disbelief. He had underestimated the man standing across from him, a fighter who refused to stay down. The crowd was electric, their chants deafening, but Kane heard none of it. His focus was razor-sharp, every fiber of his being locked onto the opponent in front of him. Dante charged again, swinging wildly, his frustration boiling over. Kane moved with precision, slipping each blow with practiced ease, his instincts taking over. He countered with a brutal hook to Dante's ribs, followed by an uppercut that snapped his opponent's head back. The sound of the impact silenced the crowd for a moment, and Dante stumbled, his knees threatening to buckle. Kane didn't let up, advancing with measured strikes, each one calculated to wear him down further. Dante swung desperately, catching Kane with a glancing blow that sent him reeling for a moment. Pain shot through Kane's side, but he planted his feet, refusing to give ground. His body screamed in protest, his muscles burning with every movement, but his mind was unyielding. This wasn't just about strength, it was about endurance, about heart. Dante's strength was fading, his attacks losing their precision. For the first time, the predator looked vulnerable. In a final act of desperation, Dante lunged forward, aiming to end the fight with one decisive blow. Kane saw it coming. He ducked under the swing, twisting his body with perfect timing, and delivered a devastating right hook to Dante's jaw. The impact echoed through the arena, and Dante crumpled to the mat, his massive frame hitting the canvas with a resounding thud. The referee began the count, but it was clear, Dante wasn't getting up. The crowd erupted, their cheers shaking the walls, but Kane stood motionless, his chest rising and falling as he stared down at the defeated man. This wasn't a victory he wanted to celebrate. He turned away, his steps slow and deliberate, blood dripping from his battered hands. The noise of the crowd faded into the background as he left the ring, the weight of the fight pressing down on him. Outside the arena, the night was cold and quiet. Kane leaned against a wall, closing his eyes and letting the silence wash over him. His body ached, his knuckles throbbed, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph, now smudged and worn. He stared at it for a long moment before tucking it away. A voice broke the silence. "You did it." Kane looked up to see his daughter standing a few feet away, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She took a hesitant step closer, her gaze softening. "You didn't just fight for yourself this time," she said quietly. "I saw it." Kane nodded, his throat tight. He didn't have the words to explain everything, to apologize for years of absence and failure, but in that moment, he didn't need to. She stepped closer, her presence a quiet reassurance, and for the first time, Kane felt the smallest glimmer of hope. As the two stood in silence, the noise of the arena faded into the distance. Kane straightened, his steps steady as they walked away together. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face it.